The flight home felt like a victory lap. After months of grueling negotiations, sleepless nights, and relentless effort, my startup had finally secured its expansion. It wasn't just a win, it was the win, the kind that put me on the map, the kind that made every sacrifice worth it. I had left home filled with excitement, my mind buzzing with plans for the future. And the first thing I planned to do? Take my new car, the sleek, limited edition masterpiece I had worked so hard for, on a drive down the coast, feeling the wind whip past as I basked in the well-earned taste of success. But when I pulled into my driveway, my heart sank. The garage door was open, the space inside eerily empty. My first instinct was denial. Maybe I had parked it somewhere else? Maybe a friend had borrowed it? But no, the memory was clear as day. I had left it there, in its perfect spot, locked, protected, untouched. I cut the engine and stepped out, my pulse quickening as I approached the house. The usual warmth of home felt off, like a place I no longer belonged. The moment I stepped inside, I was met with my father's smirk, a look that instantly put me on edge. "Ah, you're back," he said, settling deeper into his chair. I barely heard him. "Where's my car?" I asked, my voice steady but sharp. My mother, standing nearby with a glass of wine, shifted uncomfortably. My younger brother, lounging on the couch in a silk robe, an expensive one, I noticed, barely glanced up from his phone. It was my father who answered, and when he did, I felt my blood turn to ice. "Thanks to your car, our son is finally healing." I stared at him, the words not quite computing. "What?" My father let out a satisfied sigh, like a man pleased with his own wisdom. "Your brother needed a retreat. Something to clear his mind, help him recover from all the stress he's been under." He gestured toward the very picture of indulgence sprawled across the couch. "So we sold it." For a moment, all I could hear was the dull ringing in my ears. I turned to my mother, hoping stupidly that she might object, that she might look at me with remorse or regret. But she just stood there, silent. "You sold my car," I said, the words slow, deliberate, because I needed to hear them out loud, to force my brain to process the insanity of it all. "For a good cause," my father said with a dismissive wave of his hand. I turned to my brother. "Tell me this is a joke," I said. "Tell me you didn't let them do this." He exhaled dramatically, as if I was the one being unreasonable. "Come on, it's just a car. You can buy another one." Just a car. The weight of the betrayal settled over me like a crushing force. Years of working, grinding, sacrificing everything to get where I was. I hadn't come from wealth. I had built myself from nothing, fought for every inch of success. That car wasn't just metal and leather, it was proof. Proof that I had done it. That I had made it despite all the odds. And they had taken it, just like that, as if it meant nothing. The worst part? They had done it without a second thought. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. The rage simmering beneath my skin was dangerous, but I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing it. "And where's the money?" I asked finally. My father's smirk widened. "Gone. Paid for his luxury retreat. He needed it more than you needed that car. A retreat. Not a hospital. Not therapy. A luxury retreat." I felt something inside me snap. Not in anger. Not in sadness. But in clarity. These people, my own family, would never see me as anything but a source of convenience. My success was nothing but a resource for them to exploit. My achievements? Their safety net. My sacrifices? Their privileges. And they thought I would just accept it. I exhaled slowly and let my hands slip into my pockets, forcing my expression to relax into something unreadable. The old me, the one who still craved their approval, who still wanted to believe in them, would have fought, would have yelled, would have begged them to see what they had done. But I wasn't that person anymore. I looked at my father, then my mother, then finally my brother, who still hadn't moved from the couch, his entitlement so deeply ingrained that he didn't even see the storm brewing in front of him. And then I smiled. A slow, deliberate, knowing smile. A flicker of unease crossed my father's face. My mother's grip on her wine glass tightened. My brother finally put his phone down, his eyebrows knitting together in something resembling mild concern. For the first time in my life, I had all the power in the room. I turned toward the stairs. "I'm going to unpack," I said. "We'll talk later." And then, without another word, I walked away, leaving them sitting in the uneasy silence I had created. Upstairs, I closed my bedroom door and let out a slow breath. My heart was still pounding, but not from anger. No, this wasn't anger anymore. This was something sharper, colder. A feeling that told me this wasn't over. They thought they had taken from me. They thought they had won. They had no idea what was coming. I sat in my childhood bedroom, staring at the wall, my mind racing. The silence of the house pressed in around me, thick and expectant. My family thought they had won. They thought they had stripped me of something valuable, that they had taken something I loved without consequence. But they had no idea. The betrayal still burned, but it no longer stung like an open wound. Instead, it settled into something else, something sharper, something colder. I had spent my life building myself up from nothing, clawing my way out of the mediocrity they had settled into. They saw me as a resource, something to be drained, to be used whenever they pleased. And I had let them, for too long, I had let them. Not anymore. I pushed myself up from the bed, my movements slow and deliberate. I straightened my shirt, ran a hand through my hair, and forced my breathing into something steady, something controlled. I wouldn't let them see my rage. That would be too easy. That would let them believe they still had some hold over me. Instead, I would give them something they wouldn't expect. I descended the stairs with a calmness that felt unnatural. Each step echoed through the quiet house, and as I entered the living room, 3 pairs of eyes turned toward me. My father still sat in his armchair, his smirk a little less certain than before. My mother stood nearby, wine glass in hand, her grip on the stem tight enough that I wondered if it might shatter. And my brother, wrapped in his silk robe, fresh from his indulgent retreat, looked up from his phone with mild disinterest. I stopped in the center of the room, surveying them, letting the moment stretch. Then I laughed. A deep, genuine, soul-crushingly amused laugh. It started slow, bubbling up from my chest, but then it grew, rolling out of me in waves. It wasn't forced, it was real. Because the more I thought about it, the funnier it became. The sheer absurdity of their actions, the delusion that they thought they could take what was mine without consequence, the way they sat here now, so sure of themselves. It was hilarious. My father's smirk vanished instantly. His forehead creased, his mouth pressed into a thin line. My mother shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting toward him as if waiting for direction. My brother, the golden child, the one who had been given everything while I had to fight for every scrap, rolled his eyes, letting out an exaggerated sigh. "Why are you laughing?" my father snapped, his tone sharp, demanding. I wiped at the corner of my eye, still chuckling. "Because," I said simply, "you really have no idea what you've done." My father's expression darkened. "Don't be dramatic. It's just a car. You're acting ridiculous." I tilted my head, considering him. "Am I?" "You can buy another one," my brother muttered, his voice laced with irritation. "It's not like you're broke." That only made me laugh harder. The way they spoke, the way they dismissed my anger, my right to be furious, it was fascinating. They truly believed they had done nothing wrong. They had taken something that wasn't theirs, sold it without my consent, spent the money on a luxury retreat, and now they sat here, utterly convinced that I would simply accept it. I let out a slow breath, finally letting my laughter die down. My father was glaring at me now, his irritation growing. My mother looked nervous. My brother, as always, was too wrapped up in his own self-importance to register the shift in the air. "You don't get it," I said finally, shaking my head. "Get what?" my father snapped, crossing his arms. I leaned against the wall, arms crossed, my amusement still lingering just beneath the surface. "Oh, if only you knew. That did it." A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, a crack in the unwavering confidence he always carried. My mother swallowed hard, shifting from foot to foot. Even my brother finally looked up, his brow furrowed, sensing that something was off. "You're being cryptic on purpose," my father said, his voice forced into something firm, but I could hear the sliver of doubt creeping in. "If you have something to say, say it." I studied him for a long moment, letting the tension build. Then I smiled. "You didn't sell my car," I said, my voice quiet but certain. "You sold a problem." The silence that followed was deafening. My father's confidence flickered, just for a second. "What are you talking about?" I sighed, as if disappointed that I had to explain. "That car? The one you so carelessly got rid of? It wasn't entirely mine." Confusion flickered in their eyes. My mother's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. My brother frowned. "What do you mean?" my father demanded. I let the moment stretch before delivering the truth. "Right before I left for my trip, I leveraged the car as collateral for a business loan," I said smoothly. "A very specific type of loan, with very specific legal strings attached." My father's face drained of color. "You did what?" he choked. My mother gasped, covering her mouth. My brother sat up straight, his entitled smugness evaporating. "You're lying," he muttered, but there was an edge of panic in his voice. I wasn't. I had taken out a loan before my trip, using the car as collateral to secure the final expansion deal for my startup. The finance company had a tight grip on that title. And now? Now they'd be coming to collect. "You didn't sell a car," I repeated, my voice calm, measured. "You sold something that legally wasn't yours to sell." My father's hands clenched into fists. "You." But I wasn't done. "And the buyer?" I continued, tilting my head. "Oh, he's going to find out real soon that he doesn't actually own it. Because, as far as the finance company is concerned, that car is still mine." Panic flickered through the room like a shockwave. My mother's hands trembled as she clutched her pearls. My father's breathing grew heavy, his nostrils flaring. And my brother, my golden child of a brother, looked as if he had just been told his life was over. "But," my father started, but his voice cracked. "You really should have asked before selling something that wasn't yours," I mused. And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving them in their dawning horror. This was only the beginning. I made my way back upstairs, leaving my family in the suffocating silence of their own panic. My father's face had turned pale, my mother's hands had trembled, and my brother, for once in his spoiled, privileged life, had looked genuinely afraid. Good. I closed my bedroom door behind me, leaning against it for a moment. My heart was still steady, my breathing controlled. I had expected anger, frustration, maybe even shame from them. But what I had witnessed downstairs, that creeping horror in their eyes, that was far more satisfying. They thought they had outplayed me. They thought they had stolen something that belonged to me, spent it, and walked away unscathed. But now they were beginning to realize they had only dug their own graves. I allowed myself a small, satisfied breath before crossing the room to my desk. My laptop sat open, notifications blinking on the screen. My inbox was flooded with emails, business inquiries, follow-ups from investors, updates from my startup's expansion. But I wasn't interested in any of that right now. No, there was only one thing I needed to check. I clicked open a folder marked Loan Agreement. The document loaded quickly, and as I skimmed through the neatly typed legal jargon, I felt a deep, unwavering sense of satisfaction. Everything was exactly as I had left it. The agreement was airtight. The car had been leveraged as collateral for a secured business loan, a loan that had, in part, helped me land my latest expansion. The best part? The contract explicitly stated that any unauthorized sale or transfer of ownership would result in an automatic breach, triggering a full repossession. And that meant one thing. The car wasn't theirs to sell. And it certainly wasn't the buyer's to keep. I let the reality of the situation settle over me. The finance company would be coming to reclaim the vehicle, and the buyer, who had likely spent an obscene amount of money to acquire my limited edition car, was about to find out that he had paid for nothing. And when that happened, my family was in for a storm they weren't prepared for. I sat back, exhaling slowly. I had options. I could have warned them. I could have called off the repossession, made a deal, found a way to resolve this quietly. But why would I? Why should I lift a finger to protect the very people who had stolen from me? Who had spent my hard-earned success like it was their birthright? No, I wasn't going to stop this. I was going to let it unfold exactly as it should. And then, when it was all said and done, I would watch them burn. Back downstairs. The moment I stepped into the living room again, the tension thickened. My father was pacing, his face drawn into a deep scowl. My mother sat on the edge of the couch, gripping her wine glass like a lifeline. My brother? He had finally put down his phone, his expression a mix of confusion and panic. I leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "So," I said casually, "how's everyone feeling?" My father turned on me instantly. "Enough of this nonsense," he barked. "Tell me exactly what you did with that car." I arched an eyebrow. "I already did." "You took out a loan against it?" my mother asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. "A very specific kind of loan. One that ties the car legally to the finance company. Which means, well, you get the idea." Silence. Then, my brother scoffed, shaking his head. "No, this is bullshit," he muttered. "You're just trying to scare us. That car was yours. You paid for it outright. I saw the damn paperwork when you bought it." I smirked. "You saw the paperwork from the dealership, sure. But what you didn't see, the financial agreement I signed afterward. The car wasn't just an asset, it was a leverage point." My father clenched his jaw, but I could see it now, that flicker of fear he was desperately trying to hide. "And what happens now?" he asked, his voice tight. I shrugged. "Well, technically, it's not my problem. But for you." I let my gaze settle on my brother. "For the idiot who spent every last cent of that money? It's a nightmare." My brother's face darkened. "Why the hell would you take out a loan on a car you already owned? Why would you sell something that wasn't yours?" I shot back. He flinched, but I didn't let up. "You took something I worked my ass off for and spent it on a luxury retreat because you were feeling a little stressed?" I shook my head. "Did you even think, for 1 second, about what you were doing? Or did you just assume, like always, that my success was yours to take?" He said nothing. And then my father's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "What do we do now?" I tilted my head. "We..." My father's eyes burned with frustration, but behind it, I saw the truth. The realization that, for once, he didn't have the power in this situation. For once, I wasn't the desperate one. For once, he needed me. I let the moment stretch, savoring it. Then I sighed, shaking my head. "I'd love to help," I said, my tone dripping with mock sympathy. "But see, you didn't care when this was just my problem. You were all too happy to sell my car, to take what I worked for and throw it away. So now? Now, this is your problem." My mother exhaled sharply, standing up. "You can't just let this happen," she said, her voice wavering. "What about family? What about—" I laughed. "Family? You're joking, right?" I gestured around the room. "Family doesn't steal. Family doesn't take from each other without a second thought. No, what you did, that wasn't family. That was opportunism." My father's nostrils flared. "Damn it, this isn't the time for lectures. We need a solution." I smiled. "You already had one." His brow furrowed. "You could have not taken what wasn't yours," I said simply. "That was the solution. That was the answer. But you made your choice. You're not going to help us?" my brother asked, his voice tight with disbelief. I shook my head. "No, I'm not." The silence that followed was deafening. I turned toward the stairs again, my movements slow, deliberate. "Enjoy the consequences," I added over my shoulder. "Something tells me this is just the beginning." And with that, I walked away, leaving them in their growing panic. Because this was only the start. The moment I left the living room, I could hear the tension explode behind me. "What the hell do we do now?" my father snapped, his voice sharp with frustration. I didn't stop walking. I didn't need to. Let them squirm. Let them feel what I had felt when I first heard my car, the symbol of everything I had worked for, had been taken from me like it was nothing. Upstairs, I settled into my chair and pulled out my phone, scrolling through my messages. Sure enough, a new email had come in from the finance company confirming that the repossession process was officially underway. The timeline was tight. The car would be seized within 48 hours, no negotiations, no extensions. And my family? They were about to learn exactly what that meant. Downstairs, the panic began. I heard my mother's voice first, high and strained. "We have to fix this. We need a plan." My father exhaled heavily. "We don't have time for a plan. We need money. Now." Silence. Then my brother's voice edged with worry. "So, what happens when the finance company comes for the car? What do you think happens?" My father snapped. "They take it." "But the buyer already paid for it," my mother said, her voice shaking slightly. "He's expecting to keep it." "Exactly," my father muttered. Another silence. Then, my brother let out a panicked breath. "Oh, shit." I couldn't help but smile. The realization had hit them. Not only had they sold something they didn't own, but now, the buyer, who had paid a ridiculous amount for my car, was about to find out that he had nothing. And people like that? People who had the kind of money to casually buy a luxury vehicle? They didn't take losses lightly. My father must have realized it too, because his voice lowered into something urgent. "We need to get ahead of this. Maybe we can talk to the buyer. Convince him to." "To what?" My brother snapped. "To just let it go? To forget about the money?" My father didn't answer, which meant he didn't have one. My brother let out a nervous laugh, the kind that barely masked his rising fear. "Dad, this guy isn't the type you just explain things to. You know that, right?" Another silence. I could almost picture it. My father pacing, my mother wringing her hands, my brother sitting there with a growing sense of doom curling in his stomach. Good. The tension reaches a breaking point. I heard heavy footsteps, then the sharp sound of something being slammed against the table. My father's voice came next, lower, tighter. "Then we figure out another way. We just need money," my brother cut in. "Where the hell do you expect to get that kind of cash, Dad?" "I already told you, I spent it." "You spent all of it?" my mother gasped. My brother scoffed. "What did you expect? You guys told me to go on the damn retreat, didn't you? You weren't supposed to burn through it in a week," my father snapped. My brother let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, so now it's my fault? You're the one who told me it was fine. You were the one who said, 'Take what you need.' You didn't seem too worried about it then." My mother made a sharp noise, cutting off their argument. "It doesn't matter whose fault it is. What matters is what happens next." "What happens next?" my father repeated, his voice nearly trembling with rage. "What happens next is we get a call from an angry buyer demanding his money back, and we have nothing to give him." Silence. Then my brother spoke, his voice quieter now, more uncertain. "You think he'll really come after us for it?" The air in the room turned thick, heavy. My father must have known the answer because he didn't say anything. My mother let out a shaky breath, her composure slipping. Of course, he would come after them. Rich men didn't just lose money. They got it back, one way or another. And this buyer? He wasn't the type to simply accept a financial hit. No, he was a well-known businessman, a man who played in circles where money wasn't just money, it was power, reputation, influence. He would not take this lightly. They were starting to understand. They had made an enemy out of the worst kind of person, and they had no way to fix it. The panic sets in. The hushed conversation below grew more desperate. My father was still trying to come up with a way to fix things, my mother was practically begging for a solution, and my brother, useless as ever, was just now realizing how deep in trouble he really was. And then, the phone rang. The sound cut through the room like a gunshot. For a second, no one moved. No one spoke. Then I heard my father take a deep breath before picking it up. "Hello?" The pause that followed was excruciating. And then, "Yes, I understand," my father stammered. I smirked, leaning back in my chair. That must have been the buyer. I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but I could imagine it clearly. A furious, powerful man demanding answers, his voice sharp, unwavering. I heard my father exhale sharply. "Look, there's been a misunderstanding." The voice on the other end must have cut him off because he went silent. Completely, utterly silent. Then, after a few seconds, "We can work something out," my father said, his voice nearly pleading now. "Just give us some time." Another pause. Then, something that made the hairs on my arms rise. A single, shaking breath from my father. A sound I had never heard before. Fear. Pure, undiluted fear. The kind of fear that only came when a man realized he was out of options. Yes, my father said quietly. I understand. He hung up the phone, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I waited, and then, we're in trouble, my father murmured. No one spoke. I imagined my mother sitting there, her face drained of color, her perfect world crumbling. My brother, his carefree life crashing down in front of him. They had stolen from me, dismissed me, laughed at me. And now? Now, they were about to pay the price. A knock on my door. A few minutes later, there was a knock at my door. I didn't move at first. I let them wait. Let them feel the weight of their desperation. Then, slowly, I stood up and pulled it open. My father stood there, his face lined with tension. My mother hovered just behind him, her eyes wide with barely concealed distress. My brother? He wasn't even looking at me. His gaze was distant, hollow. My father cleared his throat. We need to talk. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Do we? His jaw tightened. This isn't funny. I tilted my head. Oh, I think it is. My mother stepped forward, her voice softer. Please. We need your help. I studied them, letting the silence stretch. Then I smiled. You didn't care when it was my problem, I said quietly. You were all too happy to take what was mine. But now? Now, you expect me to fix this? No one answered. I let my smile widen. Enjoy your luxury retreat, little brother, I murmured. Something tells me you're going to need it. And with that, I closed the door in their faces. Because this was only the beginning. The silence outside my door lingered for a long time. I could almost feel them standing there, absorbing what had just happened. My father, fists clenched, trying to will himself back into control. My mother, desperate to smooth things over, searching for some way to manipulate me into fixing the mess they had made. And my brother, useless, spineless, probably still trying to figure out if there was a way to make it all disappear without facing consequences. I didn't bother opening the door again. Let them sit in it. Let them feel the weight of their actions for once. I turned back to my desk, checking my phone. The finance company had sent another confirmation. The repossession order was already being processed. Within 24 hours, the car would be gone, taken back, legally and without argument. And the buyer? I didn't have to wait long to find out how he was taking the news. The phone in the living room rang, sharp and shrill, cutting through the thick air of their misery. My father hesitated before answering. I could hear it in his movements, the reluctance, the dread settling over him like a heavy cloak. Then, his voice. Hello? Silence. Even from my room, I could hear the anger bleeding through the receiver. The buyer wasn't just upset, he was furious. What? No, listen, there must be some mistake. Another pause. My father's voice wavered now. No, we can work something out. Then, nothing. Just silence. I smirked. That was the moment he realized there was nothing to be done. The buyer had already been contacted by the finance company. He knew that he didn't actually own the car, that his money had gone into thin air, that he had been played for a fool. And men like him? They didn't take humiliation well. You have to understand, we didn't know. My father was trying to salvage it, trying to plead. But I knew the truth. The buyer wasn't the kind of man who cared about apologies. My mother gasped suddenly, her voice rising. We'll get the money back, she blurted out. We just need time. Another pause. Then, something I had been waiting for. My father's voice turned from desperation to something else, fear. A quiet, almost breathless, yes, I understand. The buyer had given an ultimatum. I heard the phone click back onto the receiver. For a few moments, nothing. Then my father exhaled, the kind of breath a man lets out when he realizes he's standing on the edge of a cliff with nowhere left to go. We need to find a way to pay him back, he muttered. With what? My brother snapped, his voice high with barely controlled panic. The money's gone. Then we find more, my father said firmly. We have to. I almost laughed. They had spent so many years treating me like an ATM, assuming that no matter what they took from me, there would always be more. But now? Now they were realizing what happened when the well ran dry. And they had no idea what to do. A lesson in consequences. I waited a beat before stepping out of my room. The three of them turned to me instantly, as if I held the key to their salvation. I leaned against the wall, arms crossed. So, how'd that call go? My father scowled, his face twisted in irritation. You think this is funny? I shrugged. A little. My mother clutched her hands together. Please, she said, her voice soft, pleading. We just need to figure something out. You don't understand this man. He's serious. He'll ruin us if we don't pay him back. I tilted my head. And? My brother scoffed. And? You're just going to stand there and let this happen. I raised an eyebrow. Oh, now you care about things being fair? He had the nerve to look outraged. This isn't just about us. If we don't fix this, we could lose everything. I smiled. Then maybe you shouldn't have taken something that wasn't yours. My father stepped forward, his voice low, controlled. Listen, you're part of this family. You can't just turn your back on us. I sighed. You keep saying family, like it means something. Like it meant anything when you decided to sell my car without even telling me. Like it meant anything when you used my hard work to pay for his little retreat. I gestured to my brother, who flinched. You made your choices. Now you live with them. But the buyer, my mother started. I cut her off. Is your problem? Not mine. I turned to leave, but my father grabbed my arm. Wait. His voice was tight, his grip firm. I looked down at his hand, then back up at him. I'd let go if I were you. For a moment, I thought he might push. That he might try to guilt me, manipulate me, force me into cleaning up their mess. But then he saw it. The look in my eyes. The cold certainty that I was done. He let go. I straightened my sleeve and gave them one last glance. You spent years taking from me, I said, voice even. I think it's time you learned what it feels like to lose. Then, I walked away. Because the truth was simple. They had stolen from me. Now, life was about to steal from them. The fallout begins. The next morning, the real damage began. I was in the kitchen making coffee when the phone rang again. My mother nearly sprinted to answer it. Hello? A pause. Then her face drained of color. She fumbled with the phone, handing it to my father with wide, shaking eyes. It's the bank. My father took the receiver, his voice tight. Yes. I sipped my coffee watching. Silence. Then, his grip on the phone tightened. No, that can't be right. We have time. Another pause. Then, a slow, painful exhale. I already knew what was happening. The finance company wasn't just taking the car. They were taking everything attached to it. The moment they realized the car had been sold illegally, they had started the process of seizing other assets to recover their losses. My father set the phone down heavily. What did they say? My mother whispered. He ran a hand over his face. We're in trouble. I finished my coffee. They had stolen my dream. And now, their own dreams were about to crumble. The final straw. The home phone rang again. My father didn't even bother picking it up this time. Instead, he turned to me. Fix this. I met his gaze, unflinching. No. His eyes burned with anger, but behind it, I saw it. The realization that this time, I wasn't going to save them. This time, they were on their own. I walked past them, heading for the door. And just before I left, I turned back. Enjoy your luxury retreat, little brother, I said, smirking. Something tells me you're going to need it. Then, I left them to drown in the mess they had made. Because no matter what they did now, the truth was clear. They had finally lost. The weight of the situation was finally sinking in, pressing down on my family like a slow-moving landslide. My father was out of options, my mother was out of excuses, and my brother, well, my brother was about to learn what it felt like to hit rock bottom. The moment I stepped out of the house, I could feel the tension behind me, thick and suffocating. I didn't bother turning back. They had made their choices, and now they were going to have to live with them. I had no sympathy left to give. I took a slow breath as I reached my car, my backup vehicle, nothing as flashy as the one they had stolen from me. Still, it was mine. They hadn't taken everything. And that was their mistake. As I started the engine, my phone buzzed. A message. From a blocked number. I smirked. The buyer. We need to talk. Soon. I let the message sit there for a moment, considering my next move. The buyer wasn't stupid. He knew now that my family had scammed him, and men like him didn't just walk away from situations like this. He'd want payback, and he'd want it fast. I wasn't going to stop him. I pulled out of the driveway, leaving my family behind to stew in their own fear. The cracks began to show. Hours later, I returned home, stepping inside just in time to hear the tail end of another heated argument. You spent it all? Every last cent. My father's voice was a sharp bark, laced with disbelief and fury. My brother's response was barely more than a defensive mumble. It wasn't like I just threw it away. No? Then where is it? I needed it, okay? The retreat was expensive. The flights, the hotel, You're telling me you spent 6 figures in a week? A nervous laugh. The kind of laugh that came when someone realized they had dug themselves too deep and there was no way out. You guys said it was fine. I stepped into the room just as my father turned on him, his eyes burning with barely controlled rage. We said it was fine because we didn't know you were draining the damn account dry. My mother, standing off to the side, wrung her hands together. We'll figure something out. We just need to. We need nothing, I cut in smoothly, making my presence known. You need something. And as far as I'm concerned, that's your problem. They all turned to me, and for the first time since this whole mess began, I saw it real, genuine desperation. My father was still trying to hold on to his authority, his confidence. My mother's usual quiet manipulations were nowhere to be found. And my brother? He looked broken. The once smug golden child, the favorite, the one who had never had to work for anything in his life, he was finally facing consequences. Please, my mother said, taking a small step forward. We just need time to fix this. Time isn't going to bring back the money, is it? I asked, tilting my head. Silence. Or did you think the buyer was just going to forget about all this? I continued. My brother finally looked up, his face pale, sweat glistening on his forehead. He wouldn't actually do anything, right? I chuckled. Oh, you really have no idea what you've done, do you? He swallowed hard. Dad said we could fix this. Yeah? And how's that going? My father exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. He looked older, worn down. What do you want from us? He asked finally, his voice rough. You've made your point. Are you really going to just stand there and watch this happen? I pretended to consider it. Yes. You think this is funny? My brother snapped. I took a slow step toward him, my voice dropping to something dangerous. I think it's justice. He flinched. You stole from me, I continued. And not just money. Not just a car. You stole something I worked years for. You laughed in my face when I came home and found out. You didn't care. So why should I? He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had nothing left to say. And then the doorbell rang. The moment of truth. No one moved. The tension in the air turned suffocating, pressing in from all sides. My mother's face went ghostly pale, my father's hands curled into fists, and my brother, my pathetic, spoiled brother, actually took a step back like a scared child. The doorbell rang again. I smiled. I think you should answer that. No one moved. So I stepped past them and did it myself. When I pulled the door open, I wasn't surprised to see him. The buyer. He was exactly the kind of man I had imagined. Tall, broad, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than my entire college tuition. His sharp eyes locked onto me immediately, assessing. You're not the one I need to speak to, he said smoothly. I smirked and stepped aside. Then, by all means. He took one step inside, and my brother actually stumbled back, eyes wide. My father recovered first. Listen, I understand that. Do you? The buyer cut in, his voice calm but cold. Because from where I'm standing, you sold me something that was never yours to sell. And now, I'm out a lot of money. That doesn't sit well with me. My mother stepped forward, her voice wavering. We can get it back. Just give us time. The buyer's gaze didn't even flicker. Time isn't what I want. The silence stretched. Then, my brother made the biggest mistake of his life. I don't have the money, he blurted out, his voice cracking. The buyer turned to him fully, his head tilting slightly. Oh! My brother swallowed hard. I spent it. I can't give it back. The buyer was quiet for a long moment. Then, he took a single step forward, and my brother's face turned white. You think that's my problem? The buyer asked. His voice was still quiet, still calm. But the room had turned ice cold. My brother shook his head quickly. No, I mean I. The buyer exhaled, glancing toward my father. Since your son is incapable of fixing this, I assume it falls to you. My father clenched his jaw. I just need. No, the buyer interrupted. You don't get to negotiate. Panic flickered across my father's face. You have two options, the buyer continued. You find a way to pay me back, or you deal with the consequences. Another long silence. I folded my arms, watching. Waiting. My father's shoulders slumped. We'll get the money, he muttered. The buyer's expression didn't change. You have 72 hours. Then, without another word, he turned and left. The door closed behind him, leaving only silence. I took a slow breath, then looked at my brother. He was shaking. Finally understanding that his actions had led him here. That his luxury retreat had cost more than just money. It had cost him everything. I smiled. Good luck with that, I said simply, then turned and walked away. Because this was only the beginning of his nightmare. The air inside the house was thick with dread. The weight of the buyer's ultimatum hung over my family like a storm cloud about to break, and for the first time, I watched them begin to truly understand what they had done. 72 hours. That was all the time they had left to fix their mistake, to come up with the money they had so carelessly spent. But there was no lifeline this time, no convenient bailout. No me. I walked away from the front door, leaving them in silence. My father still stood rigid, his hands clenched at his sides, his jaw set in the kind of grim expression men wear when they know they're out of options. My mother had collapsed onto the couch, head in her hands, her polished, well-kept world crumbling around her. And my brother? He sat slumped in the chair, shaking. His retreat, his indulgence, his expensive flights and five-star meals, it had all vanished into nothing. And now, the reality of what he had done was swallowing him whole. Good. I leaned against the doorway, watching them. So, I said, my voice light, mocking, what's the plan? No one answered. Come on, I pressed. You always have a plan, don't you? Usually, it involves taking from me. Still, nothing. I tilted my head. What, no lectures? No long speeches about how we're a family? My father exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. We need to get the money back. I let out a slow, amused breath. You just now figured that out? He ignored me, turning toward my brother. You have something left, don't you? Some savings. My brother blinked up at him, dazed. I maxed out everything. The retreat, my father cut in sharply, was a waste. And now we're screwed because of it. My brother swallowed hard. I didn't. You didn't think, my father snapped. That's the problem. My mother, voice small, finally spoke. Maybe we could. What? My father turned to her, exhausted. What could we possibly do? Silence. Then, he exhaled sharply. We need to sell something. Panic flickered across my brother's face. What? Assets, my father said, already thinking, calculating. The house, the cars. You mean your car, my brother muttered. I smirked. Oh, that's rich. They all turned to me again. I met my father's gaze. You had no problem selling my car when it suited you. Now it's time to return the favor. His eyes burned with frustration, but he didn't argue. He knew I was right. I pushed away from the wall, stretching lazily. Of course, you could always ask for a loan, I said, feigning innocence. Maybe go to the bank. See how generous they feel about a family of scammers. My father gritted his teeth, my mother exhaled sharply, and my brother flinched. No, that wouldn't work. They knew it. Their financial reputation was already tarnished. No bank was going to take a risk on them now. I watched the realization sink in. the slow, creeping understanding that they were running out of time. And then, my father's face darkened. "You could fix this," he said quietly. I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you have money," he said, stepping toward me. "More than enough. Just lend us the amount. We'll pay you back." I laughed. A real, genuine laugh. "Pay me back? Like how you paid me back for the car you stole?" His jaw clenched. "I'm serious," he said. "You could stop this right now." I shook my head, still amused. "Why would I?" "Because we're family," my mother pleaded. I took a step closer, my amusement fading, my voice dropping to something cold. "You keep saying that word, like it's supposed to mean something. Like it's supposed to erase what you did." My brother finally stood, his voice breaking. I didn't know." I turned to him, eyes narrowing. "You didn't care?" Silence. Then I delivered the final blow. "The finance company will recover the car." My father stiffened. "The buyer? He's taking you to court." My mother inhaled sharply. "And as for your credit, dear father?" I tilted my head mockingly. "It's ruined." My brother let out a shaky breath. "There has to be another way." I smiled. "There was. You could have not stolen from me." He said nothing. And that silence? That was the sound of justice. Watching it all crumble. By the next day, things had only gotten worse for them. I sat in my room, sipping coffee, as the chaos unfolded downstairs. The finance company had called again. The car was officially being seized. There was nothing left to negotiate. The buyer, on the other hand? He wasn't interested in waiting for legal action. He wanted his money, and he wanted it now. I listened as my father argued with the bank, his voice rising in frustration. My mother sobbed into the phone, probably calling in favors from old family friends who had long since moved on. My brother? He was quiet now, probably sitting somewhere, staring at the floor, wondering how the hell his life had fallen apart so quickly. By evening, it had all collapsed. The car was gone. The money was gone. And the buyer? He had officially filed legal action against my father. That was the final straw. I walked downstairs just in time to see my mother in tears, clutching my father's arm. "What do we do?" she whispered. My father didn't answer. He looked empty, defeated. My brother stood off to the side, his robe long gone, replaced by a hoodie and sweatpants. He looked lost, small. Like he had finally realized what it felt like to have nothing. I stepped into the room, taking in the destruction. Then I smiled. "Well," I said, "that was fun." They all turned to me, my father's eyes burning with what little pride he had left. "You think this is funny?" I tilted my head. "No. I think it's fair." My brother, voice raw, finally spoke. "You really don't care, do you?" I met his gaze. "No." Silence. Then, I picked up my bag and turned toward the door. "Where are you going?" my mother asked, her voice trembling. I looked over my shoulder. "Anywhere but here." "You're leaving us?" I exhaled, shaking my head. "You left me first." And with that, I stepped outside, letting the door swing shut behind me. They had stolen from me. And now? Now, they would finally know what it felt like to lose. The moment I stepped outside and shut the door behind me, I felt it. Relief. Not the fleeting kind, not the surface-level satisfaction of winning an argument, but the deep, bone-deep realization that I was finally free. For years, I had allowed them to use me, to drain me, to take from me without consequence. Not anymore. I took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill my lungs. The chaos behind me was no longer my problem. They had made their choices, and they were paying the price. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a pawn in their game. I was done being the safety net. Done being the one they turned to when they burned everything to the ground. This time, they would drown on their own. I got into my car, the one they hadn't managed to steal, and started the engine. As I pulled away from the house, I didn't look back. They weren't my burden anymore. The fallout begins. 2 days later, I heard the news. The buyer had followed through on his legal threats. My father had officially been sued for fraud. Not just for selling something that wasn't his, but for knowingly conducting a fraudulent transaction. The case was airtight, there was no way out of it. He had lost. Worse, the courts weren't going easy on him. The judge had ruled against him swiftly, and the penalty was devastating. My father was now legally required to repay every cent of the money he had stolen, along with damages for the fraudulent sale. And since he didn't have the money, everything he owned was now at risk. Their house, the one they had always lorded over me, the one they assumed would always be their safety net, was on the verge of being seized. The cars? Gone. The luxury? Over. For the first time in his life, my father wasn't the one in control. He wasn't the one calling the shots, making the rules, dictating who got what. No, now he was the one scrambling, desperately trying to cling to the wreckage of his own destruction. My mother wasn't handling it well either. The woman who had always prided herself on appearances, who had spent years curating the perfect image of a respectable, put-together family, was now exposed for what she really was. Complicit. Enabling. A willing participant in the downfall of everything she had once held dear. And my brother? He was the one who had fallen the hardest. The golden boy's fall from grace. He had been the favorite, the untouchable one. The one who never had to struggle, never had to earn anything. He had coasted through life, shielded from consequences, wrapped in the comfort of his parents' love and their willingness to fix his mistakes. But now? Now, there was nothing left to fix him. His credit was destroyed. His savings? Non-existent. The retreat, the indulgence, the carelessness, it had all caught up to him. I had heard from a mutual acquaintance that he was struggling to even afford rent now. The golden boy, who once lived in five-star hotels and private suites, was now sleeping on a friend's couch. The man who once mocked me for working so hard, for being too focused on money, was now learning what it felt like to have nothing. It was poetic. And the best part? I hadn't lifted a finger to make it happen. They had done it all to themselves. Moving on. While they were drowning in their own ruin, I was thriving. The expansion of my startup had been an overwhelming success. The loan I had taken against my car, the one they had tried to steal, had been repaid in full, and my business was stronger than ever. I had options now. More money, more stability, more freedom. And most importantly, more peace. For the first time, I didn't feel obligated to carry the weight of my family's failures. Their problems weren't my problems anymore. Their downfall wasn't my responsibility. I wasn't their crutch. And I never would be again. The inevitable call. It took about a month before my phone rang. Blocked number. I let it ring. Then, a voicemail. I debated deleting it without listening, but curiosity got the better of me. I pressed play. Static. Then a sigh. A long, exhausted sigh. Then, my father's voice. I know you don't want to hear from me. I know I don't deserve it. But we need help. We don't have anywhere to go. The house is gone. Everything is gone. A pause. Then, quieter, almost broken. I don't know what to do. Silence. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the phone. Then, without hesitation, I deleted the voicemail. No response. No second chances. They had made their choice. And now, they were finally learning the hardest lesson of all. That when you betray someone who once cared for you, you don't get to ask for mercy. A final drive. A few weeks later, I found myself behind the wheel of a brand new car. Better than the one they had stolen. Faster, sleeker, completely paid off. It was mine. All mine. I took it for a long drive along the coast, the wind whipping past, the engine purring like a beast beneath my fingertips. I didn't think about them. I didn't think about their downfall, their suffering, their regret. They weren't my concern anymore. I had moved on. And while they had stolen my car, my money, my trust, they had never been able to steal my success. And that was a lesson they would never forget.